If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Daniel chapter 3. And I want to speak to you this morning about a commitment that leads to deliverance. Now, in Daniel chapter 3, there are no prophecies, just one of the best-known narratives of faith that's challenged millions over the millennia. Everybody pretty much that's heard, if you've ever heard of the book of Daniel at all, you've heard of the 3 Hebrew children, and you've heard of the fiery furnace, and that's where we're at today. And I want us to read the entire chapter 3 because it's one narrative, one story, and I want us to look at their lives and see what we can glean from them that might apply to us so that we can be more steadfast and more faithful no matter what flames may come our way. Beginning in verse 1, it says, Nebuchadnezzar, the king made an image of gold. The height was 60 cubits, and its width was 6 cubits, and it was set up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the province to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the counselors and the treasurers and the judges and the magistrates and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and then a herald proclaimed loudly, To you a command is given, O peoples, O nations, men of every language, that at the moment that you shall hear the sound of the horn, the flute, lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you're to bow down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whosoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at the time when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples of nations and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded to Nebuchadnezzar the king and said, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whosoever does not fall down to worship shall be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing flame. There are certain Jews whom you yourself have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was enraged and angry and gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. Then these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, Is it true? Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, that you do not serve my gods, nor do you bow down to the golden image which I have set up? Now, if you're ready at the moment when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music to fall down and worship the image which I have made, then very well. But if you do not worship, you will be immediately cast into the midst of a burning flame of fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing flame, and he will deliver us out of your hand. But even so, even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are going to serve our God, and we will not worship your gods, and we will not fall before the image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. He answered them, giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times hotter than it had ever been heated before. And he commanded them, his valiant warriors, who were men in his mighty army, to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. And then the men were all tied up with their trousers and their coats and their caps and their clothes, and they were cast into the midst of the flame, being bound. For this reason, the king's command was so urgent that the furnace had been extremely hot, and the flame of fire slew the men who threw in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. But these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, fell into the midst of the furnace, a blazing fire, still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was astounded, and he stood up in haste, and he said unto his officials, Was there not three men that we cast into the fire bound? And they said, Well, O king, certainly. And he said, Look, I see four men loosed, and they're walking about in the midst of the flame without harm. And the appearance of the fourth is like the Son of God's. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, come out, you servants of the Most High God. Come out here. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego came out of the midst of the fire, and the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the kings of high officials all gathered around and saw in regard to these men that no fire had had any effect on them. Their bodies were not affected. Their hair was not singed. Not even smoke was on them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants, whom have put their trust in him, even violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies not to serve any other god except for their God. Therefore I make this decree to any people, nation, tongue, that says anything offensive to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses shall be turned into rubbish, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in such a manner. Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Sounds something like we heard last week with Daniel. We see that at the end of the story, he's praising Daniel. I want to bring something to your attention, and we'll bring it back. The reason that we'll see this again next week, and the reason that we see the king professing this is what he's doing. He's enamored with the God of Israel. He's impressed with the God of Israel, but he's not a believer or a follower of the God of Israel. And there are a lot of people who are impressed with God because God does some pretty amazing things. But being impressed with God will not get you into heaven. Only a commitment to him will. And Nebuchadnezzar is not at that point yet. But at least he's telling everybody else, if you say anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, then there's going to be problems. Now, this takes place in the 13th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He had already destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and he'd already went in 3 times and took out captivity of the people that were left over in Jerusalem. So as Jerusalem grew again, he would take those captives. So now there's been 3 captivities, and the temple is destroyed. It's been 10 years since the vision of Daniel. And so here we have an account of their biblical names as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And, of course, we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, and the reason being is their names were changed by the king. But what we have here is 3 profiles of faith. Now, the thing is, and this is the danger in this, the danger is when we look at these guys, we look at them as heroes. I mean, and they are heroes of the faith, no doubt about it. But listen, they were just normal men like you and me. Absolutely, only thing that's different is their commitment was so strong. They said, and I love this, they said, King, we're not going to bow down. We don't need time to think about it. We're not going to bow down. And if our God chooses to deliver us, well, okay, he'll deliver us. But guess what? He is going to deliver us out of your hand. They knew, even if I go into the fiery furnace, even if I burn up, King, I'm free of you. The Lord is going to deliver me. That much I know. And by the way, if he chooses not to deliver me, that's okay too. They were men who were so in love with God and so committed to him, but they were just normal, everyday men. And so perhaps this is also in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 34, where the writer Hebrews says, talking about the heroes of faith, and these men quenched the fury of the flames. Personally, I think that's who he's talking about. But this passage reminds us also of Philippians 1:21, which says, for me to die is Christ, or for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Now, John Piper says that is the greatest verse in the whole Bible. Why? Because it's a win-win. If you live for Christ, you get Christ. If you die for Christ, you get Christ. Where's the downside? I agree with him. It's a win-win situation. Whether they live for him or whether they die for him doesn't really matter. They get Christ in the end. And so I have to agree with Piper. I think that's one of the most perfect passages in the Bible. Four things I want us to look at this one. First, in the first 7 verses, I want us to look at the presence of the image. Now, one thing we need to accept is that God's people are always going to be confronted with idols in this world, and we're going to be pressured to worship them. The outside world wants to pressure you into a mold. They want you to approve of the things that they approve of. You know, if my grandfather, who died in 1974, never had anything but a black and white TV at his house, but if he were to come back and just see the commercials on the major network channels, I'm not talking about, you know, Hell's Box Office and all these others. I'm talking about just your normal everyday TV. If he saw those commercials, he'd be like, why are you watching those things? How are you letting the devil into your home? That's exactly why the world is trying to flood us, because they want us to be like them. Temptation's going to come. There's going to be those fiery furnaces that you and I have to walk through. Now, first off, notice this image. It was magnificent. 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, and overlaid with pure gold. It was lavish, like everything that Nebuchadnezzar did. He went beyond extravagant. Extravagant wasn't good enough for him. In fact, as you read through the different books of the Bible and you find out all that Nebuchadnezzar did in Babylon, it was amazing what he achieved in his lifetime. And so when we look at this, we need to realize, why did he build this image? There's 3 reasons that he built this image. Number 1 was for his own deification. Now think about it. 40 years as a general, never lost a battle. I mean, everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. He conquered and he conquered. Intellectually, there was nobody intellectually on the planet that could keep. I mean, he was an academician. Everything he touched just turned out perfect. And so he thought, well, just like all the rest of gods, why can't I be a god? I mean, what man on earth is like me? Nobody. I should be deified, so I want a 90-foot statue that resembles me, overlaid with pure gold. So he wanted to be deified. The second thing, it was built for the glorification of man. This is what we call secular humanism. Look at what man has done. And when we say look at what man has done, what are we saying about God? We're saying that we've done it without his help. That's what secular humanism is all about. It's what have I done? And so this was built to magnify the greatness of humanity. And both of those would be an offense to God. And third, for the unification of religion. Notice what he says here. To all the people, to all the nations, in all the languages, even the dignitaries from other countries who had come to serve in his court as representatives of their country, they were forced to bow down. And so basically what this is doing is saying, when I bow before this, it's unifying religion. All these other gods that were worshipped before, all their people now have to worship me. And so Nebuchadnezzar was receiving the worship for this because it was a statue of him, 90 feet tall. So when we think about this, all 3 of those would be offensive to a holy and righteous God. Failure to bow resulted in death. Now notice verses 4 and 7. It says, peoples, nations, and every tongue. This is showing it's comprehensive. Even visitors were supposed to go and worship and bow down before this image. Now, second, look at the persecution of the majority in verses 8 through 11. By the way, Christians are under biblical mandate to obey the laws of God or obey the laws of the land, except where those laws come into conflict with God's laws. God's laws always supersedes man's laws. It's like I was talking to people about the different countries I go to and witness. I obey the laws of the land. When I go to China, I know what the laws of the land are. I know what I can share. And I can share Christ in good faith and never break the law in China. I just can't say, and you need to do that. I can tell them about how he's changed me. This is what he's done for me. I just can't tell you, you have to do that. So I can go anywhere. At all the places I've been, I've never, that I know of, intentionally broken the law. We obey the laws of man, but the Bible makes it clear that we're not to bow down. For example, in Deuteronomy 5, 7 through 9, the Lord declares, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an image of any idol of anything above heaven or below the earth or in the waters below the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children of the sins of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generations for those who hate me. Notice the accusation here in verse 8. Brought charges. That literally means to eat the pieces of. This is what he's saying. These Chaldeans, which are the top caste, there's 5 levels in Babylon of wise men, and the Chaldeans are the top level. They are the most brilliant, supposedly. They have achieved a certain status. And so they're saying, let me tell you, king, what you've done. Those guys you appointed, now there's jealousy here. Why in the world wouldn't you appoint me, king? Why do you put this Jew over here? He's not even, here's what he's saying. It literally means to eat away at. It's saying, King, they are deliberately, publicly slapping you in the face. Because you've said that you're going to put them under the fire, you're going to burn them up if they don't bow down. And they're not bowing down, and they're doing it maliciously. It's intentionally. They're discrediting you because you said they have to bow down, and they're out of arrogance. They're not bowing. They're just eating away at your integrity. They're eating away at your credentials. They're eating away at who you are. So what these wise men were saying, if it was correct, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego was totally disrespecting the king publicly, which it forced the king to act. Do you notice what he says? He goes, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, is it so? What these guys told me? I mean, I've been good to you. Look, I promoted you a couple times. Look at what you, I mean, it's almost like you're not in captivity. I've been good to you. Surely you can respect me. I'm going to give you a second chance. King, we don't need a second chance. We're firm to start with. But he was surprised by it. These men were intent on Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah being put to death because they were jealous. Look at verse 12. There were certain Jews that you've appointed over your administration for the province of Babylon. That's jealousy. By the way, the world's jealous of you too. They are. Because you've got something they don't have. They could have it if they wanted it. It's free. They just don't want it, but they don't want you to have it either. The world wants you to fall into sin with them. Look at the perseverance of the minority in verses 13 through 18. When the instruments play, thousands would bow in the dust before the image, but not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. Things hadn't changed much. Even today, Christians who refuse to go along, we're put down, we're mocked, we're accused of different things. In fact, I've heard it said you have too. The problem in America today is sitting in these pews. The problem in America is Christians. And let me just say this, I have to agree with them. They're right. For America to go the way that particular group of people want it to go, we're the problem. But the real problem is one day when the Lord comes back, they're going to realize they were going the wrong way, and we were the answer. We've got what they need. But the world wants us to go along. By the way, the world's not happy living in sin and evil itself. It wants to drag you and I with it. So, perseverance. When the instruments begin to play, everybody else is bowing, but not them. So, let me give you an example. Back in the early 1980s, I worked for Z-Medical and did a great job. And we had all of Georgia, Eastern Tennessee, and we bought the 15 counties in Northeast Florida as a distributor. And they sent me down to be the district manager. So I'm now district manager at Z-Medical, and our vice president would come down almost every other week. And he certainly come down at least every third week. But he'd come down on Monday, and on Monday we would discuss how to grow things, training and all this different kind of stuff. But he liked to drink. He came from a whirlpool background. It was vice president for Z-Medical. And so we would go on Monday afternoon to Bennigan's and have a couple drinks. Then we'd go to next door to Steak and Ale and have a dinner, nice steak dinner on Z-Medical, and have a couple drinks. Then we'd go back to Bennigan's to have a couple more drinks. So on average, Monday night, I'd have 4 to 6 drinks with him. And I was also going at the same time to First Baptist Orange Park. And one Sunday, God got a hold of my heart. He said, Ed, you're walking down the fence row, and there's a post ahead, and you've got to make a decision. You either get off with me on my side, and you live the way I want you to live, or you get off on the world side. Choice is yours. You do what you want to do. And I really felt convicted, and I remember that was on a Sunday, and I said, God, forgive me for living my life this way. I want to be on your side, and I'll follow you, but God, I need your help. Well, you know what's going to happen. The vice president's coming in town the next day. So we go to Bennigan's, and he gets his vodka sour, whatever he was drinking, and I get a Diet Coke. That was before Coke Light and Coke Zero. I got a Diet Coke, and he looks at me, and he says, Ed, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Okay. So we go to Bennigan's to eat, or Steak and Ale. He gets another drink. I get another Diet Coke. Ed, what's wrong? This went on for about 3 or 4 times that he was coming down. By the way, he liked to have somebody to drink with. And I just told him, I said, look, I made a commitment to God. I believe that God is telling me I don't need to do this. This is not good for me. It's not a good image in the community. God's told me to get off with him and not to live my life this way, and that's what I've chose to do. So if you want to drink, I'm not going to condemn you. I'm not looking down on you. I'm just telling you I'm not going to drink. Oh, Jesus turned the water into wine. Ed, you can have some wine. He pressured me, I finally left Z Medical over it. Why? Because it was a commitment that I had made. The world's trying to force me into it. And by the way, Romans 12:2 says, do you not be conformed to this world. The world it literally means don't let it press you in its mold. The world wants to mold you the way it wants you to be, and God says, don't do it. Let me mold you the way I want you to be. So here in Babylon, the king is saying, I want you to bow before me. I want to mold you into this. And they're saying, you can't do it, for the Lord's already molded us into what he wants us to be. But things haven't changed much today. Sinful humanity wants us to be drugged down with them. And then on verse 13 through 18, notice the persistence. These boys just would not bow no matter what. Temptation often carries with it not only the idea of threat, but also giving you a second chance. Well, you missed this one. Like with my vice president. He kept coming down. Oh, come on. Nobody's ever going to know. I mean, we never see anybody in here anyway that you know. Like, come on, have just one glass of wine. No, I can't. I made a commitment. Oh, I could have broke the commitment. Then I'd had to be on my knees on Sunday asking God to forgive me for it. I chose not to do that. And so the world keeps on and on and on. There's furnaces out there, and you and I have to walk through those sometimes. But also I'm reminded that sometimes God's plan is honored when he lets you go through the furnace. I mean, look at the book of the martyrs. The blood of the martyrs sometimes achieves God's plan. I think about the 4 killed in Iraq. When they were killed, everybody said, nobody go replace them. And I was amazed. I remember we were in Richmond several times after that, and people were talking about our college and career kids, people in seminary. 10 times, 20 times as many people are signing up and say, I'll take her place. I'll take his place. Is it sad they were killed? Absolutely. But you know what? It's just like Paul said, absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So from the day they died, God honored them and took them to heaven, and God honored their death, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people have signed up to take their place in Iraq. So sometimes God might let you go through the fire. Sometimes he gets his honor and glory through delivering us from the fire. Now, we all want to be delivered from the fire. I mean, anybody here want to go through it? And to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter. Not if Philippians 1:21 is right. What does it matter? To live is Christ and to die is Christ. Look at verses 14. And by the way, there's things worse than death. There's some things worse than death. And I'm convinced when we make a commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ and we don't keep it, to me that's worse than death. Now, if you're a believer, I mean, what's death going to do to you? It's going to give you the positive side. I just get to heaven before you do, or you get to heaven before I do. But think about it for the people who are not believers. When they die, what happens afterwards is horrible. There's a lot of things worse than death. Look at verses 14 and 15. Notice that even though the king was angry, he was willing to give him another chance. And so Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they said, no, we won't do it. Verse 14, the king's astonished that he wouldn't bow down. He couldn't believe it after how good he had been treating him. I guess he had forgotten about the God of Daniel. Also, I would have thought that Nebuchadnezzar, he would have remembered the stories from 150 years earlier when Sennacherib, you remember Sennacherib, king of Syria? The Assyrian king. He's going to overthrow Jerusalem. Jerusalem's all boarded up. They've been praying, God, deliver us. And God sent one angel and slew 185,000 Syrian warriors in one night with one angel. He would have known this. Those stories would have been everywhere. He would have known this is the God of Israel. This is the Hebrew God. And then notice what he says, who's going to deliver you out of my hand? Perhaps he forgot what happened 10 years earlier. Or perhaps he just didn't take it to heart deep enough. Even today, when you and I stand for things, people are amazed. Like I shared with my vice president, he was really amazed that it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. It's a commitment that I made to God. It's a big deal. Verse 16, I love this what they said. We don't need time to consider our answer. I love the way that King James puts it. King James says, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. In other words, King, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but we don't need time to think about it. I don't have to even think about it, and I don't have to be careful with how I tell you. I'm just telling you, I'm not going to do it. If God delivers me good, if God does deliver me good, he's going to deliver me from you. He may deliver me from the flame, but he will deliver me from you. And so you do what you have to do. Play the instruments. That's what he said. Do it. Verse 17, take note of their confidence in the Lord. If he chooses, he will deliver us. And then verse 18, so they were committed to God no matter what. And I love this. Whether it's a miracle or not, whether it's deliverance or captivity, whether it's life or death, it's not an issue. My commitment to you, God, is I'm going to do it. That was their commitment. Wasn't conditional in any shape, form, or fashion. What they're doing, they're displaying full, unfettered faith in God. You know what I mean by unfettered? Without any restraints. They have no conditions. God, I'll be faithful under these conditions. God, if you will, I'll be faithful. Unfettered. No restraints whatsoever. God, whatever you want, I'm here. Which, by the way, I find it interesting that Nebuchadnezzar, after throwing the statement out, and who's going to deliver you from me? Which God's going to deliver you? I mean, all the other gods? Who's going to deliver you? You're in my hands. You're in my captivity. And then rather than just having his regular servants tie him up and throw him in, he takes he selected the best of his army to bind them up and throw them in, and we find out it was so hot, it burned them to death. Why did he choose that? I'll tell you what I honestly think. I honestly think what he's doing, he is so arrogant at this point, and you see it in his verbiage. He is so arrogant. Here's what he's telling their God. Hit me with your best shot. I'm about to throw these little boys in. In fact, I got my mighty warriors. They have tied these guys up tight, and they're throwing them in. Come on, hit me with your best shot. Show me what you got. That's a dangerous thing to do. There's nobody, ever has been or ever will be, able, if God hits you with his best shot, you will not survive. In fact, people may not ever even remember you. But that's how arrogant he was at this particular time. And then the fourth thing I want us to see is the preservation of the saints. This is what's great. These boys, not only would they not bow, but they refused to burn. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego were mentioned 13 times in this chapter. Now remember, if God says it once, it's important. If God says it 2 or 3 times, it's really important. Why does he for 13 times mention Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego? I mean, it's almost as God standing on his throne, hollering down the halls of heaven, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, which we know was not their Hebrew names, but it's almost like he's honoring them because of their faith. He knows their heart. He knows what they're about to go through. And how faithful, I think about Stephen. The Bible says Jesus stood. He was seated on his throne. He stood in honor of Stephen as Stephen, that great martyr, walked down the streets of heaven. God, in the person of Jesus Christ, stood for him. I think here we have evidence that God is recognizing and honoring these three by the name which they would be called by there. Verse 19 through 22, pay close attention to the furnace. And the reason I think there's a lesson here, because there's always furnaces that come in life. Sometimes it's criticism or mocking, or maybe you applied for a job and you didn't get that job because people, he goes to church, he's a Christian. Oh yeah, we don't want to let that kind of people in our job. Or maybe you're supposed to get a promotion. You're the best qualified. But people have found out that, well, they go to church. They're Christians. They live for God. So maybe you don't get that promotion that you deserve. There's always a furnace to go through. And some of them are mild and some of them are not so mild. But here's the thing I love about it. One of the things that this teaches is you and I don't go through the furnace alone. There's somebody there with us. And it is somebody that looks like one of the sons of God. It is the Son of God. He's there with us. I mean, think about it. These other guys, they're throwing them in. They get burned to death. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego were standing there in almost like an air-cooled room. You realize God delivered them not only with his power, but think about it for a minute. He delivered them with his presence. He didn't just send an angel and say, go down there and take care of that, handle that for me. Again, I think this is a Christophany. This is where the second person of the Trinity, we know as Jesus later, this is where he comes, and on behalf of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, he just takes good care of them. And then we see King Nebuchadnezzar in total amazement, total disarray, going, what? Didn't we throw 3 in? We did, right? Well, there's 4, and they're loose. And they're not being consumed by the fire. I like it in verse 25. And the fourth is like the Son of God. Now, it's amazing that Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, could even recognize deity. Now, I don't think he knew that he was in the very presence of God. But one thing he did know, he knew that God was delivering these boys. Verse 24 and 25, the only thing that burned on them was their bonds. The shackles he put on them burned, nothing else burned. Not even, don't you love the fact that it didn't even smell like smoke? I mean, the Lord does a miracle here, and by the way, he does it right. I mean, there's no evidence whatsoever on them that they've been through the furnace. And I would submit to you that when you and I go through trials and tribulations, we go through the furnace, when we come out the other side, if we've done it his way, he does it right for us. And we wouldn't even have the smell of the furnace on us either. Verse 26 through 28, these men were preserved by the power of God, but also the presence of God. And then the last thing I want to share with you, verse 28 through 30, is the promotion from their profession. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego had professed their God was the only true and living God, and look at the results. They stood firm, they were steadfast. Verse 28 and 29, the king praises the person of God. He says, there is no other God who is able to deliver in such a way, in such a manner. Verse 30, the king prospers God's people. Notice what he says, and he prospered them in the province of Babylon. Sometimes we think, well, 2,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, 4,500 years ago, all these heroes that we look at, and we think, but they were great men. Does anybody today still live that way? Earlier, when I came in, I told you about Saeed. I remember when I met him in 1998. He was going to be my translator. Didn't know very much about him. Didn't realize that he had been born in the roughest, poorest part of Bangladesh in Dhaka. He'd gotten involved with drugs early on and had become fairly well off selling drugs. He himself used to take a horse tranquilizer, liquefy it, put it in a needle and shoot horse tranquilizer in his vein. And got caught, went to prison. Best thing in the world, he got caught and went to prison for 4 years. And while he was there, he met a Christian. And they become friends. And before he got out, he became a Christian. Totally changed his life. And got out. And of course, what happens? The world tries to get you back. So all his old drug dealing buddies try to get him back. And he says, I can't do it. I'm never getting that lifestyle again. I've given my heart to Jesus. They beat him up with what we would call a 2-by-4. And he's laid in a pool of blood 2 days later when he woke up. But anyway, by the time I had met him, and he's just an amazing guy. One of my students had gotten sick, and I'm over at the pharmacy, a little green pharmacy sign. I knew I could get some ciprofloxacin for him, and so I'm going to go over there, and so he's out in the middle of the roundabout. The British build roundabouts everywhere they went, and so he's talking to this guy in the roundabout, and he's a cleric in a white robe. And so I'm getting the thing from the pharmacist, and all of a sudden I hear, and I'm dressed like this without the jacket. I'd been meeting with the president of the university and the provost of the University of Dhaka, 28,000 students, and I hear this, run, Ed, run! And he takes off. And I'm like, what are we doing? So I take off running too. And so we run about 3 blocks in 105 degrees. You know what I look like at the end of... And I was about the size I am now, so it's not like I'm a sprinter or something. We duck into the back to find this little cantina, this little cafe, and so I'm like, Saeed, what is wrong? He goes, that man out there. I said, yeah. He said, he's a cleric, and his son is a cleric. I said, yeah. He said, well, I was just witnessing to him. I said, you're witnessing to a cleric? He said, yeah, and I could tell things were getting intense, but when I told him that Muhammad's eternal destiny was in question, that's when he was actually calling for a fatwa, a jihad. He was calling for him to be stoned to death right there. And then he drags me into it by hollering, run, Ed, run. Yeah, I just want to kind of tell you, he witnessed to everybody. But he asked me one day, he said, do you want to see where my ministry is? And I said, yeah. And so he took Dr. Isle and I, and we're standing on this wall. We're overlooking this village. It's in downtown. It's a village within a village within a village in downtown Dhaka. 25 million people, something like that. And it's where the scourge of the earth go. It's where those who are drug addicts, who are pretty close to dying anyway, that's where they go. And you got people, they walk around with a needle, and you can see HIV jumping off of it almost. And he takes and feeds them. And so we had bags of peanuts. And we're giving them handfuls of peanuts to give them some kind of nourishment, because there's a lot of nourishment in it. And we see all these things, and I see a 12-year-old girl, and her blouse is all tore, her pants all have holes in it, her hair's all matted, and she's full-blown HIV because of the horrendous things that some of these men in this village have done to her. And he said, her life is a tragedy. He said, but about 6 months ago, she gave her heart to Jesus. So at least, anyway, at that time, he'd had about 35 or 40 people saved out of doing that. And he knocks on one of the doors, and he says, you guys want to come in and see this? And I said, I wasn't sure what I was going to see. We walk in, and they actually had black tar heroin, and they're lighting it in a spoon, and they're waiting for it to turn to liquid and then vapor. And they had these little glass pipes about that long, and they're trying to inhale the vapor. And when they do, immediately they just pass out. And there's a guy in the back that drags them out, and there's already about 8 or 10 out on the side. I'm telling you, if there's a hell on earth, I've been there, and that's where he works. And I asked him, I said, Sahid, I said, how did you get the job of taking care of these people? He said, when I got saved and gave my heart to Jesus, he said, after I had confronted my drug friends and told them, I'm not getting back into it, he said, God told me I understand those people. And he said, it's my job. God called me. That's my call in life. Go out and tell people and make my name known. Stand firm for me here. Don't let the world press you into its mold. So with that said, in conclusion, how do I apply this today? What can I take home with me that'll make me better? Remember that we do not have to submit to physical or spiritual compromise, because God is able to deliver us. So be faithful to the convictions that God has given you and leave the problems to God. The convictions is what they stood on. The fiery furnace was a problem. They said, we'll leave it to God. We'll let him deal with it. You will have fiery furnaces. You may be going through a fiery furnace right now. Leave it to God. Let him deal with it. That's his problem. He's prepared to deal with it. The second thing is God's public reputation is often connected to faith of his people. I didn't say it's dependent on it, but it's connected. When people see you and I standing firm and living out the teachings of God, it is credible to his integrity. So don't claim to have faith in God. Demonstrate it. Show people. And then honor and obeying God is not popular, and sometimes it gets you into trouble. But we must live our lives honoring and obeying God, every word that he has given us. Don't let us be pressured into the mold of the world. And then last, in Philippians 1:21, where it says, for me to live as Christ, to die as gain, if that's true, then we need to take it to heart and realize there's nothing God's going to put us in, no situation he will allow us to go through that he's not already there with us. He was in the furnace before they got there. He already had the air con going before there's absolutely nothing that if you're following God, there's nothing you can get yourself into that he's not already there. He will be there.